Thanks for coming out this morning. As always, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Those of you who have been on other tours that I've led have heard me say this, and you will hear me say this every time. I always feel that when you have a question, the answer to that question might be the information that is of most valuable to you. I don't have a, pre-scripted tour, so it's not like, I'm sorry, I can't answer your question. We have to walk over to that plant now. So just ask your questions. I always find that visiting other gardens, whether they be public gardens like the Ralston Arboretum or other public gardens in this area, or ones distant from here, or private gardens, during late summer. Well, it's not really late summer yet. During summer is really valuable because it's a difficult time in the year. Some things are tired, and I just like to see what's still looking good at that time of the year. We have some good examples in this garden. I think in a shade garden, there are far fewer things blooming in a shade garden in summer than there are in spring. A lot of the spring ephemerals are not really shade-loving plants, but they are little plants that don't know how to operate a chainsaw, so they've evolved to make use of the sun in a woodland before the leaves come out on the trees. But a few things blooming in this garden now. You see a hosta. It's an older one called halcyon. But I also note the foliage. A lot of hostas are tired looking by the time midsummer gets here, but that foliage really still looks nice and fresh and clean. Very often those hostas with blue waxy foliage hold up better than other types. Liriope muscari, the monkey grass, or most people I think just call it Liriope. I've always really loved it, and extensive research has proven that it does not need to be grown in a line. It will grow sort of scattered out here and there. Now, there are two species of Liriope that are common in the nursery trade. There are other species that are, can be obtained through specialist nurseries like Plant Delights. But the two that are common are Liriope muscari, which is a clump former and well behaved. The other one, Liriope spicata, spreads rapidly, and I don't think the foliage is ever quite as pretty as the foliage on muscari. And spicata can have its place if you need, a wide-spreading ground cover, but it's a nightmare in a garden like this because it'll spread quickly and weave its way through other plants, and it's also not quite as pretty in bloom as muscari are. Liriope muscari is. A tip for a shade garden, because there's not too many things blooming through the summer months, is to work with foliage, and I think there's fine examples in here. Various ferns. The autumn fern is tough, and this fern, lovely thing. Let me move over that way.
Sorry, Doug.
What's that?
I said sorry.
This fern has the common name of upside down fern, but sometimes common names aren't very useful if they're not really common. But come take a look at this one. It's Arachnoides standitii. I don't find that it's one that makes a big plant real quickly, but it seems to be one that's well adapted to our climate. The sarums, the wild gingers have beautiful foliage. Most of those are evergreens. Of course, aspidistras, and this hellebore behind us, this complex hybrid hellebore, Anna's Red, has really beautiful foliage through pretty much all year. I'll point out one last plant. This is a little native wildflower. Hasn't yet started blooming, but we wouldn't see it in bloom at this time of the day because the flowers open up about 7, 8 o'clock at night. They're little white stars. Very, very fragrant, a very pleasant fragrance, or at least I like the fragrance. It's Silene ovata. The leaves are ovate shaped, sort of oval shaped. Oh, thank you. I meant to talk about the cyclamen. The mid to late summer is when the hardy cyclamen start blooming. They sort of spit and sputter for a long time, and then about September into October they bloom real heavily. This is cyclamen heterofolium. Heterofolium means foliage like hetera, which is English ivy. And typical color is pink, but these are white flowered ones, and we'll probably see some others as we go along. Cyclamen heterofolium likes well-drained, dry shade. It has foliage fall into spring, and the foliage, I think, is even more showy than the flowers. Several things in this area. We'll see other examples when we get up to the bulb border, but you see at the top of this walkway some rain lilies blooming. The rain lilies comprise 2 different genera, Zephyranthes and Hybranthus. Zephyranthes referring to the zephyr breezes that bring the rain, and anthes in that name referring to flowers. They're called rain lilies because they'll bloom intermittently on and off, but when there's a rain, about 3 days later they just burst with a large number of flowers like that. That's a one called La Buffa rosea, which is a wild, probably natural hybrid collected in Mexico. It can be pink as well. The little herbaceous perennial here, I knew forever as Calamintha. We're now told to call it Clinopodium. I was thinking recently that if we ever did a plant family garden, we have a monocoque garden, but I think a plant family garden would be more instructive. We'd probably have to keep everything in pots, so when the taxonomists change families, we can just shift the pots around. But this is a superb, easy, well-behaved perennial. It's been in bloom probably since May and will go up pretty much till frost. And as you notice, there's lots of pollinators visiting it. The typical color is white. There's also a blue strain that's very, very pale blue. If you put the two together, you'll see that one is blue and the other one is white. It dies away to a small crown. The time to take cuttings of it is when it first comes back into growth in the spring before it starts flowering. The sunlight's in our eyes, but I wanted to point out this purple coneflower. In the perennial border, the purple coneflowers we have are largely done. And I can't give you an exact name on this coneflower. It's one that started out as a tissue culture clone named Ruby Giant. It has seeded around, so it's no longer the original clone, but still very much like it. And it just keeps on putting up new flower stalks, and it'll bloom up until frost. So it's a bit floppy, but I think if you combined it with some good sturdy grasses like some of the panicums, the switchgrass, I think it would stand up quite nicely. And we have to go past the cascade wall and admire our new plantings. The genus Eryngium in Europe are known as sea hollies because their most common species occurs on the dunes on the coast. But this is one of our native Eryngiums. This is Eryngium aquaticum. Perfectly happy growing in standing water, but it will also succeed in drier situations. There's one in the scree that's quite dry, and the plant's half as tall, but it's alive and blooming. It's just starting to bloom. It's a good plant for pollinators. Make a beautiful cut flower, but grow your own, don't cut ours. And surprisingly, it's the same family, the umbel family, with carrots and parsley and fennel and dill and all those plants. This is Sarissa japonica. I knew it for a very long time as Sarissa fetida. I never figured out what part of the plant is fetid. But notice all the bees on it, primarily our little native bumblebee. Not all that many honeybees, and if the honeybees really liked it, they would be here, because there are, I don't know, what, 3, 4, 5?
A million?
No, beehives here at the
honeybee
beehives here at the Arboretum. But it's really good to feed our native bees. Now, the interesting thing about this is a little wild type Sarissa, and the flowers are tiny. And you know, I don't think I'm being too unkind to this plant to say that it's not overly showy in bloom. We'll take a few steps this way and show you some garden forms of Sarissa, and you'll notice there's very few pollinators visiting them. I was so excited to discover this easy, low maintenance shrub with such a good supporter of pollinators that we stuck cuttings last week. I think we got almost 100 cuttings off this plant. Tim says anything will root. I tend not to want to take cuttings where it's bloomed from every node, but we did find enough brand new vegetative shoots that weren't blooming that I think they'll root nicely, and we'll have plants of it available next spring. But there are, I guess, 3 different garden selections of Sarissa here. This lovely little pink one, and I don't see, well, right now I'm not seeing any insects visiting the flowers. And it sort of surprises me, because this is still a single flower. There are double flowered forms of Sarissa, and certainly it's common that a double flowered the double-flowered form of a plant is less attractive to insects, because often the nectaries and the reproductive parts become the additional petals, so there's no nectar for the plant. But I would have thought that this single flower would still invite the pollinators, and you can't say that I scared them away, because the bees over here didn't flee when I approached the plant. And this is a fairly small white one. And then this is just a odd little, sort of freaky little dwarf type Sarissa. They are great garden plants. They're evergreen. They're very low maintenance. They're tough as all get out. And they're not at peak bloom right now, but they bloom for, I don't know, much of the summer. There's also several with variegated foliage. This is Gaillardia. I always forget what order the name comes in. It's Gaillardia estivalis. Estivalis, I think, referring to summer. Variety Winkleri. Straight Gaillardia estivalis is yellow, and the typical color of Gaillardia estivalis Winkleri is purplish, and we'll see that in a little bit, but this is a white form of it. And this is a plant that JC introduced to the Arboretum a long time ago. If any of you remember the marble statue that was here over by where the rose garden used to be, these were planted around there, and I remember several super hot, dry summers, and it just went on all summer as if it was, in the Garden of Eden. And it spreads slowly. We don't get any number of seedlings to note, but it's just a superb plant. Tony Avent has the yellow form of it, so I asked him if he'd make it available to us. Little zinnia species. It's the same genus as the common zinnias, but no, the common zinnias were not developed from this plant. It's just a relative, but little plant native to the southwest. The growing conditions up here are full sun and rather dry, but this little woody mint, Poliomyntha bastamanta, has been, Lord, blooming probably since May or so. The big, I don't think they're bumblebees, I think they're the big carpenter bees, like the flowers especially. And it is in the mint family, but the mint family, the genus Mentha are the true mints, but there are lots of other members of that, a lot of other genera in the family, salvia, lavender, rosemary, and Poliomyntha in the rose garden. Yeah, this is a chaste tree. If you went on the Plantsman's tour led by the interns, Adam pointed out a different species of chaste tree. This is the common one. The chaste trees are Vitex, and this is Vitex agnus castus, and they're called chaste tree or monk's pepper because monks would eat the seed because they thought it encouraged their chastity. But this is a true dwarf. This hasn't been pruned. It's one that I'm sure many of you know Bobby Wilder, the Bobby Wilder Visitor Center right down here. It's one he found. We're evaluating it. I think it has great potential because Vitex left to its own devices is going to be, about the size of a medium-sized crepe myrtle. They're become great big trees. I know in Charlotte I would see ones that hadn't been pruned, and there were these gorgeous big trees when they were in bloom. But not every garden has room for that. And see I guess a carpenter bee enjoying the flowers. It's a great plant for pollinators. Summer is certainly the time for crinums, but having said that, there are some crinums that are already done blooming for the year, but some of the best will bloom periodically through the summer. This is a hybrid one. The hybrid is Crinum X digwittii, and this cultivar is Mahon. Probably the majority of crinums are really more night blooming plants than daytime plants. In the, about dusk or so is when the flowers really sort of raise their heads and flare open and are at their most fragrant. And this one has a really good fragrance. I don't know if it's fragrant at this time of the day. Some of the fragrances are so good that if you're avoiding sweets, just go outside and smell the crinum, and it's as good as having dessert. This is Alamo Village, which blooms repeatedly through the summer. And we'll see other crinums as we go through the garden. They are in the Amaryllis family, and they grow from a great big bulb. Some of them are more difficult to dig up than a large shrub. Not all of them, but some of them are. The ginger lilies, Hedychium, are in the same family as the culinary ginger and turmeric and cardamom. This is Hedychium coccineum, coccineum meaning red or scarlet, and I don't know, I'd call this sort of salmon orange, but this is a good one. Like cannas, they put up new shoots through the length of the summer, and generally each shoot eventually blooms, so if they start early enough, they're in bloom for a long time. And this particular cultivar is Disney. Some of them are very fragrant. It's not fragrant now. I don't know I don't remember if coccineum is fragrant typically, but many of them are very, very fragrant. Crepe myrtle. Yeah, no. I think that's dynamite, is it? No, that's not dynamite. Red Rocket. Yeah, that's Red Rocket, which is actually its trademark name. The real cultivar is Wit number 4, WHIT, the breeder. it's a mess nowadays that plants have cultivar names and trademark names. The African violet family, the Gesneriaceae, is mostly tropical plants. But these syningias were totally unknown to us gardeners, I don't know, 20 years ago, and now there's quite a few different hybrid selections. This is Bananas Foster. They make a big tuber underground, and they were a little bit slow returning this spring. I guess the winter was damaged them a little bit, but now they're back in full force. And they bloom all summer. They're really a great value. We saw a few rain lilies down when we started. This is Zephyranthes Drumondii, which is primarily spring blooming, but will bloom periodically. The lovely yellow one is Zephyranthes reginae, reginae meaning of the queen. Lovely pale yellow. And this is, notice at the farmer's market on Saturday, a lot of people were selling tuberoses. This is same genus but a different species. And it just has a large number of blooms. The question was, what is the difference between the two genera that are called rain lilies, the Zephyranthes and Hebranthus? That's one I actually know the answer to. Because I often do wonder, well, why are these two groups of plants not all the same, or what distinguishes them? Zephyranthes, I'll pick a flower. I don't think they've counted these yet today, so they won't know. Zephyranthes, they're in the, I guess they're in the Amaryllis family, not the lily family. Those two families have a lot of similarities. But both Zephyranthes and Hebranthus have the same number of flower parts, but in Zephyranthes, the 6 stamens are all the same length, and in Hebranthus, 3 are long and 3 are short. And another difference that I noticed, that the fruit, the seeds, not the fruit, the seeds of Zephyranthes are plump. There's actually some, food being stored inside them, where the seeds of Hebranthus are paper thin, like a lot of lily seeds. And I know I can find you Hebranthus seeds. I might be able to find you Zephyranthes seed as well. That one might be. Anybody want this flower? Well, these aren't the best examples, but when I know up here there's some Hebranthus tubispatus seeds. Here's another lovely one, and the rain lilies are real fun to grow from seed because almost all of them will germinate in about 5 days. Now it'll take, probably a year and a half to 2 years before they're blooming size, but when I've started them, and I didn't have a greenhouse at work to put them in, I just grow them as a houseplant through the winter months. A pot of rain lily seedlings not going to survive the winter outside above ground, but if you keep them growing all winter long, you'll make a lot more progress. But they're real easy from seed, and many of the species also multiply real quickly, so when a clump gets full, dig it up and divide it pretty much any time of the year.
What is the bamboo that looks like a tomato plant?
This plant here
is that a bamboo?
No, it's a dahlia. No, she doesn't believe me.
Oh, I don't.
She thinks I'm crazy.
It looks like a bamboo.
Libby, where's your photograph?
Is it?
It's a tree dahlia.
Oh my God. When does it bloom?
It usually blooms too late to bloom very well.
Oh, weird.
It usually blooms late October at the earliest, and it realized that it was tall, but it still wanted to be admired. So instead of continuing the upward ascent of the stem sort of arches out at this angle, and the flowers are pendant. So you're looking at flowers not terribly much bigger than, one of these dahlia flowers. Well, I guess they're maybe about twice that size, but instead of, being up overhead, they're at this angle.
What color?
The typical color is about the color of this green lily. The color most people call pink. But there's also a white form, and there's also double forms of both the pink and the white. We have a double white one. This is the single a pink one. I wish they bloomed a little bit earlier because they're really quite beautiful. They're native to Mexico. What else? Am I right, Libby? Mexico? Yeah. Where probably an area where either frost occurs much later or frost doesn't occur in the winter months. Yeah. Here's another hybrid Syningia. I think that's Scarlet O'Hara, I think. And looking for, here's the little copper lily, Hybranthus. It doesn't have any flowers today. It has been blooming its head off earlier. And see one fruit. I don't know. Somebody want to quick count those for me? I don't know. What would you say? 60 seeds or more, maybe? I don't know. 50. These Zephyranthes seeds aren't typically as plump, but you can see these are just real fine papery seeds. I'll pass them around, and you can, by the time they get to the end, there'll be one stuck to every sweaty palm. But that's one difference. If I find another rain lily,
You want some seeds?
sure, you can send this one that way.
Wait.
The seeds are papery. This is a tiny little rain lily. This is probably not worth growing. See, it's just absolutely tiny. Look how it's very pink on the outside. And what is its name? I don't remember. We should mention the lilies. A lily that's almost weedy. Can you imagine that? Lilium formosanum. Formosanum. Next Tuesday I'm presenting a presentation to the volunteers on plant names because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. But Formosanum can refer to the country formerly known as Formosa, which is now Taiwan, but it also means beautiful. And I'm sure the country of Formosa was named Formosa because someone thought it was beautiful. But this is an Asian species of lily. A lot of lilies are very, very hard and slow to raise from seed. They have very complex germination requirements. They have to be warm, and they have to be cold. And after that cold period, they will develop a root. But then they have to be warm and cold again before they develop a shoot. And then they're tiny little things forever. Lilium formosanum, you can, if you grow them well, you could have a small blooming plant like these ones on the edge there in probably a year's time. And it's really a very beautiful plant in the winter because the seed pods are upright, and it looks like a candelabra of ochre pods or something. And the pods are probably 5 or 6 inches long, and the seeds are papery like the Hybranthus seed that you all passed around. And so in the 3 chambers of the lily pod, there's just this continuous stack, so probably thousands of seed in every pod. They do come up sometimes where we don't want them, but they can be transplanted to where they're better placed. And we should mention the dahlias. The dahlias blooming for a month. They're not at their best in the heat of the summer, but they're looking pretty good because we've had some decent rain in the last week or two. If your dahlias get real shabby, midsummer or so, you can cut them to the ground and they'll regrow and they'll be real fresh and have a really nice display up till frost.
About dahlias, are almost certain varieties planted here? I remember as a kid having to dig all the dahlias up to save for next year.
Right. The question was, are most varieties of dahlia winter hardy here? I would say most are. I think in the common dahlias, I think we're dealing with just one species that's been developed into endless forms. And certainly I've grown some that haven't come through the winter. Now these came through the winter and we were cold, but the more significant aspect of the cold we had this winter was its duration. I'm not a native southerner, but I've been in the south since 1979, and I think I know what's typical of a winter here. The ground will freeze overnight and it'll thaw out the next morning, so frost never penetrates. I remember growing up outside of New York City in northern New Jersey. In the winter, the ground is as hard as this concrete most of the winter because it freezes solid and it freezes deep. That's why if you had a basement on the house, you dug deep to get below the frost line. But we had 200 hours of below freezing temperatures, and that meant the frost penetrated much more deeply in the soil than usual. So a lot of things a lot of herbaceous things that would normally survive the winter didn't. I shouldn't say a lot, but some. I think a lot of our oxalis, the wood sorrels and such, didn't survive the winter because the frost penetrated more deeply. Yeah, this fruit of Zephyranthes seeds, you probably, if had I thought ahead, I might have brought out a little cup or something, but was it worth passing those seeds around for you all to see? All right, this is a Zephyranthes. What you had was a Hybranthus, and you see, if you feel the seeds, there's a little bit more food stored in that. This is a Hybranthus. Vivian, another difference between Hybranthus and Zephyranthes, you see the Zephyranthes flowers tend to be held straight up on the stalk, and the Hybranthus tend to be held at an angle, but this is a Hybranthus. And I'm not going to dig for my glasses out of my pocket, but I think if you look inside, you'll see 3 of the stamens are long and 3 are short. This is a lovely Hybranthus florii. It's much like Robustus, but has this darker sort of purple-red on the outside. And it's Acanthus, that it was in the Acanthus family. This is shrimp plant. And this is real typical type of inflorescence for the Acanthus family, to have lots of bracts, but then the true tubular flowers are extended out from the bracts. That's very much like an Acanthus inflorescence. This has been blooming from the bottom up. This shrimp plant is actually winter hardy if it's planted in the ground, but the reason for this pot is people tend to, walk the shortest route, and so they don't, walk here and make a right turn on the brick. They walk straight across this little strip of sod or turf, and so the pot is here to sort of force people to walk this way. Because it's okay to walk on the sod, but when every single person walks in one location, it killed the sod. Anybody want to know about any other plants in this pot?
Yeah, what's that you have your hand on?
This is tapioca.
Gorgeous.
It's a variegated form of cassava, which is, if you go in a Latino market, it's sold as yuca, big woody tuberous root, which is also the source of tapioca, depending on how it's processed. I'm probably the only person in this group who loves tapioca, but never store-bought. The same recipe my grandfather made, but it's good when you make it from scratch.
Is that also what farinha is made from in Brazil? Farinha that they sprinkle on all their food in Brazil?
I don't know. I've never heard that.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never heard that. It is a tropical plant. It's a staple food in much of the tropical parts of the world. So, I'm sure it's part of a lot of Latin American cuisines.
What cultivar would be the one we have?
It's the one we've had in the no, it's not. The one we've had in the Arboretum forever is, they're both Abutilon megapotamicum. And the one we've had in the Arboretum forever is Little Imp. This is essentially the same, but it's a paler yellow. It's one called Ruffles. And we have some stock plants in the nursery, so we'll stick some cuttings sometime soon. It's winter hardy like Little Imp is.
Is it winter hardy in a container like that?
I wouldn't expect it to be. And they are called flowering maples because the leaves are maple shaped, more so on some species than other, but they're not at all related to maples. Yeah, that's Little Imp. It's still there, and it's on our plant cart. But it's in the hibiscus family. I'll pass this around and you can see, 5 petals like a hibiscus and the same arrangement of, it's actually the filaments of the stamens and the stigma are all fused together until the tip when they flare out to separate flowers. Fun little plant. And this plant here is Cuban oregano. It is used as a culinary herb. I think when you get into hot, steamy climates, the Mediterranean oreganos that we all know do not like that climate, so you grow this tropical plant instead. This is a cultivar called Amazon ochre. And it's, the genus Coleus, I don't think exists any longer. It's now with the Swedish ivy type Plectranthus, and this is the Cuban oregano is a Plectranthus. Any questions before we move on? Actually, I'll point out this salvia. This is a modern hybrid salvia. And I found its label yesterday because I don't remember. Here it is. It's I never know on these annuals. Well, it's actually not annual for us. It says Salvia rocking with the trademark symbol on rocking and then playing the blues. So I don't know what name you ask for when you go in the garden center, but it's much like Salvia indigo spires, which is an older hybrid, and it's a hybrid between Salvia farinacea, the mealy cup sage, and Salvia longispicata, and would get about 8 foot tall if you staked it, but it always falls over. So then they irradiated indigo spires to create one that only got about 5 feet tall, maybe 4 feet tall, mystic spires. And this is similar breeding. I don't know how they originated it, but these plants here came through the winter, so I wouldn't say this type of salvia is 100% winter hardy, but it's reasonably winter hardy, and it just goes on all summer. You see the bumblebees are enjoying the flowers. So the flowers are usually bobbing up and down. Just a great plant and fairly drought tolerant. We just saw that blue salvia, and I said one of its parents was the mealy cup sage, Salvia farinacea. This is the white form of Salvia farinacea. Salvia farinacea in most of its forms is winter hardy. The one that's most common in the nursery trade, Victoria, which is sold as a bedding plant in the spring, is not winter hardy, but every other Salvia farinacea I've grown has been. Tony Avent named 2 different selections of Salvia farinacea. This white one, I sort of think of it as more sort of silver or gray, and a blue one, and he found them in a graveyard in Texas, and the family name was Duhlberg, and one of them is Augusta Duhlberg, and the other one is somebody else, female name. But they'll just go on all summer. If, again, like the dahlias, if they got ratty, you can cut them to the ground and they'll soon be back in growth and bloom. Phlox paniculata, common native. A lot of the older garden forms suffered from powdery mildew. This is John Fanick, F-A-N-I-C-K, a name I just learned this morning because I didn't know it, but I looked it up in their database. I love the late daylilies because I always regret when the early daylilies are done, or the main season daylilies. This little, what color is it? Sort of lavender. I guess most people would call that blue. It's far from being blue. It's reasonable to mistake it for a verbena, but it's actually not related to verbena at all. It's actually in the borage family, which is also the family of pulmonaria and comfrey and Virginia bluebells. And one thing that sets it apart from a verbena is that it has what botanists call a scarpoid cyme. Now, scarpoid is referring to scorpions, and if you look at the flower stalk, it curls over, sort of like a scorpion's tail. And this is the same genus, Heliotropium, as the one that's often grown as a houseplant that has this absolutely glorious fragrance, but this has no fragrance. And the fragrant one is not winter hardy here, not overly good as a summer annual, but this is a winter hardy perennial that dies away completely in the winter. You think it's gone, but returns every year. And it blooms from May up until frost. You see there are a lot of creatures visiting the flowers. And I've known dry summers where it just keeps on blooming despite the drought. Here's the same little calamintha we saw earlier. This is a native euphorbia. Euphorbia corollata, referring to a corolla or crown. It has these little white flowers for many, many months in the summer. This is a selection from Plant Delight's nursery. It's now about certainly its 3rd summer, maybe its 4th. It has not bulked up the way I wanted. Go to Plant Delight's and you'll see plants that are about like this big across. So I don't know why it's not thrived here. I've grown, just wild types years ago that certainly made much bigger clumps.
Is it crowded out?
I don't think so, because it doesn't, it would normally grow in like a prairie-like setting. It occurs in North Carolina. It's native to a good part of probably east of the Rockies and east of the Appalachian Mountains. The plant grows up above its shorter neighbors, so I don't think it's being crowded out. It's just being grumpy, I guess. One of our native hibiscus grandiflorus. Oh, and the yellow guys, we always get questions about. It's in the hibiscus family, but it's not in the hibiscus genus. It's in Abelmoschus, which means it's in the same genus as ochre. And you see that does look quite a bit like an ochre pod, but if you ever objected to the prickliness of an ochre pod, this is like 10 times more prickly. Don't ever put one in your pocket. But the flowers are best in the first half of the day. By time we work on the border in the evening, they're faded, but they just go on for a long period of time. Most people wouldn't expect it to be winter hardy, but it is winter hardy here. But even in locations where it's not winter hardy, you'll get plenty of new seedlings to replace the ones from the previous year. The ones that have started earlier and are already done blooming, I've found that if we cut them to the ground, they will regrow and rebloom again. Provided it's not already September, but do it in midsummer or so when they're done blooming, and they'll rebloom. Another rain lily. This is an old hybrid called Grand Jacks. We saw that these are the Perennial Plant Association met in Raleigh last week. National Nursery Trade Organization promoting herbaceous perennials, and somebody from Mount Cuba, and Mount Cuba is a public garden in Delaware that does a huge amount of research on plants native to the East Coast. They mentioned 3 phlox that were they thought the best for mildew resistance, and one of them was the John Fanick I pointed out earlier, and these are the other 2. Robert Poore, Poore, is this tall sort of phlox purple one, and the white one with the purple eye is Delta Snow. Those who have a mild acquaintance with the mountain mints, again another genus in the mint family, the pycnanthemums, know a species like Pycnanthemum muticum, which spreads like a mint. And we have some in pots. They're in like quart pots, and the rhizomes are out, like 18 inches from the pot, just ready to take over the world. But and actually, if you have a large garden and you want a ground cover, it's superb for that. One of my former clients had such a garden, and it was on one of the tours for PPA last week, and Ann Spafford, the horticulture professor from NC State, mentioned that was the biggest mass of Pycnanthemum puticans she had ever seen. But this is a different species. This is Pycnanthemum lumicii from Loomis County, Tennessee. It gets its name from Loomis County, Tennessee, but it's also native to North Carolina and I think many of the states in the southeast. And it's a clump former. These 2 plants are I guess I planted them 2 years ago, and you can see there's still 1 plant, 2 plant. The 3rd one didn't do too well, so these are younger plants I planted this spring. But it blooms for an extended period of time. Again, a great pollinator plant. But then leave it for winter interest. The little seed heads look like little sedum seed heads, and they're sort of charcoal gray and real pretty all winter as well. When people move from colder climates to this part of the South, it's good to give up trying to grow the plants that did so well for you in the north that don't do too well down here. And there's a small number of salvias that are real common in cooler climates, like Salvia nemorosa, many different cultivars. But when you get to this warmer part of the country, there's so many other salvias that are just superb. This is a hybrid called Amistad. It's been blooming probably since May, and it will go up until frost. Hummingbirds like it quite a bit. And it's become a great big plant, but it's not spreading. It dies away to a crown about this big, and this might be its 5th summer in this location. You saw the flowering maple, the abutilon. This is another hibiscus relative. I've always known it by the common name of Scotchman's purse because it doesn't open. And I guess nowadays that's politically incorrect, but despite not opening, the big bumblebees, the big carpenter bees, will force their way into the flower, and hummingbirds also like it. It's been blooming for at least a month and will go up until frost. Native to the southwest, very drought tolerant. The typical color on that Scotchman's purse, the malvaviscus, is this whatever color that is, sort of more orange than scarlet, but not orange. But there's this pink form that's just starting to bloom, which is quite lovely. There's also a white one that's sort of a creamy white. If you remember back those salvias up there, the Rocking the Blues or whatever it was, this is the original hybrid indigo spires. The time I saw them so very tall, it was in a garden in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, but typically they get about this height, and if they get any taller they fall apart, but it has some good sturdy neighbors to lean into. What else to point out? Oh, the white Joe Pye weed. Typically the flowers are sort of purplish. This is a selection called Bartered Bride. In a good year, the flowers would be covered in butterflies. I don't think we're having a good butterfly year. Has anybody else had that experience, or are your gardens crowded with butterflies? No. I wonder if all those mosquito control things that are being sprayed in people's yards are cutting back on our insects, because those products certainly are not specific just to mosquitoes. Yes, thank you. So the dark blue salvia back here, salvia, I've always known it as Guarnitica, but I guess people here at the Arboretum researched and found out that it should be Salvia caerulea. I don't object to that name because cerulean means blue. Guarnitica is not all that much fun to say, and I think is referring to a place. But the typical forms of Salvia guarnitica spread quite aggressively. This is a newer selection. Ignore the label. This is not black and blue. It's black and bloom with an M on the end, B-L-O-O-M. And it has bigger flowers, more flowers in a spike, but it also doesn't spread underground. So that's a big advantage. We're still haven't completely eliminated the remnants of black and blue, but we're trying to. We're trying to because we're trying to make the border a little bit lower maintenance, and maybe we'll get there someday. This is absolutely glorious native, the cup plant. You can see there is some little bit of moisture down in the cup. The leaves, the pairs of leaves clasp the stem. It's in the genus Silphium, and the specific epithet is perfoliatum because the stem sort of perforates the foliage. And I don't know if it serves any purpose at all, but they will collect water there. The leaves are very sandpapery. It's a showy thing. These are young seedlings. It's usually closer to 7-8 feet tall. Butterflies and other pollinators love the flowers, and then when the flowers are done, the goldfinches will come and harvest the seed. Another real interesting feature of the plant, this one isn't being all that dramatic, but the stems are very, well, these are determined to make a liar of me, but the stems are rather square, usually very square. Maybe they need to be bigger plants.
Square-ish.
Yeah, they're squarish. This one is looking squarer. Yeah, this one's real square. It's amazingly square. And yes, very often when you encounter a plant with square stems, it's a member of the mint family, but This is an exception. All right. Oh, here we have our state butterfly, the tiger swallowtail. They're usually very common because it's one of the most of the other swallowtail species are very specific in what the caterpillar eats, but the tiger swallowtail, you might not be seeing it. It's back amongst those cup plant flowers. The tiger swallowtail caterpillar eats a wide range of things, including common things like tulip poplar leaves.
See those cup flowers flop pretty good too. I want to get taller.
They flop? Usually not. Usually not. Not in our experience. I don't know why they misbehaved this year. Maybe. Yeah, this is a hibiscus. Today's seeming to turn into a hibiscus tour. This is Hibiscus trionum, the clock flower. It's an annual, but it comes back from seed every year. I don't know that we ever planted it. Trionum. The calyx is quite pretty. The thing that surrounds the calyx is what you call the whole cluster of sepals, and surrounding the flower bud or the fruit. But it comes back from seed every year. It's never really a pest. We talked about the heliotrope when we're at the top of the border. It produces carpets of seedlings, so you will have to deal with that if you grow it, but it's easy to eliminate the excess seedlings, and it's just in bloom through the worst of the summer that it's really worthwhile. Is that me again? Contrast of colors is useful in a garden because I didn't see this at first because it's the same color as the heliotrope underneath it, so a color echo to no good end. This is a little iris relative. You see its foliage. Eneolophus fimbriatus. These haven't been through the winter yet. I'm not sure they're going to be winter hardy, but they were planted a few months ago. Wayne, you might have planted them. And like Cypella, the flowers fade by midday, but it produces a long succession of flowers. The common Abelia X grandiflorus, the X indicates that it's a hybrid between two species. Once you get beyond two species, you don't use a specific epithet like grandiflora, you just give it a cultivar name. But Abelia X grandiflora is a hybrid between a train. It's a hybrid between Abelia chinensis and I think the other parent is uniflorum or something like this. This is a hummingbird moth, one of the most fascinating creatures in the world. Is it a moth or is it a hummingbird? There was a period when I went years without seeing one, and I thought maybe it was just a fevered fantasy of mine and they didn't really exist, but they're thoroughly fascinating creatures. Anyhow, this is Abelia chinensis, one of the two parents. Now, it's a absolute butterfly magnet. It's very fragrant. I don't especially like the fragrance, but everybody's nose is different. And I would never say it's anywhere near as beautiful a plant as its hybrid offspring. For one thing, it's deciduous. Abelia grandiflora is evergreen. And though I don't like cold weather or winter all that much, I love the leafless forms of most deciduous trees and shrubs. But this guy is ugly in the winter. It's just coarse and colorless, sort of like this gray ghost of something. But if you want to attract butterflies, it's just really, really good plant for that. And all of the Abelia chinensis and the Abelia grandiflora are just tough as all get out. Now, a NC State student has been working on these impatiens. You might not, here's another seed strain, this white one over here. You might not recognize it as an impatient. It's Impatiens balsamina. Its common name is balsam. I don't know why it's called balsam, because I expect something to be fragrant like a balsam poplar when it's called balsam. But it's a true annual. It produces seed. If they start early, often the plants will produce so much seed they'll exhaust themselves, but there'll be new seedlings coming up underneath them, sort of like some of our worst weeds. But more sun tolerant than most impatiens. We haven't watered these except the first few weeks to get them established. They're just an old-fashioned annual that just sort of once you get it, you tend to have it. And I'm sure like the common impatiens, well, you see they're just loaded with fruit. When the fruit are ripe, they probably explode. To delight of children like me. Probably not quite right. Well, there went. You've all had this experience, I'm sure. Usually, if they're really close to exploding, just touching them will cause them. But see the what are they? The different parts of the outer coat of the fruit reflects real quickly, and it's to expel the seeds far and wide. We'll cut through here.
What's the research the student's doing?
He's just trying to develop seed strains that come true to seed, true to type. This is one he calls, I think he calls it like peppermint stick or something like that. Most of the others are, he's selecting for separate colors, so you could sell seed of a white one and you knew you would get white ones. And he's also, some of them he's going for height or compactness. Yeah, it's the same species Impatiens balsamina. I don't know, what would you say? We have like 10 or 12 different seed strains?
I think so. Yeah,
About
more
that.
in that.
Yeah, we'll see a few more.
So those seeds could winter over ground and come back next.
Yeah, they will. They will. And I'll probably have to pull them out. The Portulaca is one that's grown from stem cuttings rather than seed. We took a few cuttings last fall, and by the time spring came, we had many to plant out, and they just go on all summer. The flowers don't stay open all day, but maybe mid-afternoon, late afternoon, they start to fade. We continued to lose some roses to rose rosette disease. That's why we have blanks. Fortunately, you can replant where you had to remove one because the pathogen isn't in the soil. Quite a few wonderful little alliums. This one, I think, is Senescens glauca, maybe? Or it might be sugar melt. Don't let my word be the final word, because I haven't been trying to keep up with all of that. The question was, are any roses resistant to rose rosette disease? And I'm ignorant of, I can't answer that question, I just don't know. You mentioned knockouts. Knockouts are definitely not resistant to it. I've heard people say they're more susceptible. My guess is that's not true. There's just an awful lot of knockout roses out there, so they're more likely to get, the chance of them getting exposed to it is greater just because there's more of them out there to be exposed. The same client had big masses of knockout roses, and now I don't think there's any left in that garden. I have wondered if some real sort of members of that genus, the rose genus, that are like outliers, like maybe Ladybank's rose seems so different from other roses that maybe it's resistant. But the really sad thing is, maybe people could breed for resistance, but all of our centuries-old garden roses potentially could be lost forever because this pathogen eliminates them. I think this pathogen is not native to this country, but I don't even know that. So I guess potentially it could spread around the world. We might be getting close to the time when people would rather get out of the sun. I'm going to say one thing about the things we grow as annuals and why so many of them are really good come the worst of the summer. Most of them aren't annuals. They're tropical perennials that don't survive our winter, so we treat them as annuals, but since they're tropical perennials, they're often from climates that are hot and humid, and so it's like, oh, finally it's 90 degrees and 100% humidity. I'm finally worthwhile weather. So now a tropical climate isn't necessarily hot and humid, it's just frost free, but a lot of the tropics are hot and humid. So things like coleus, sweet potatoes, lantana, they're from hotter climates, so this is just a piece of cake for them. I think annuals deserve a place in our gardens, especially if you want lots of color for a long period of time. And they're not that much trouble to plant each year, and once they're established, they're pretty low maintenance. Lilacs, well, I think crepe myrtles look a lot like lilacs, and they bloom through the worst of the summer. I don't know how they do it, they're just amazing. Okay. Hydrangea paniculata often is planted in shade and it doesn't show what it's capable of. Plant it out in the sun and it's just glorious. This is a dwarf one with the trademark name of Bobo. But typically they're quite large shrubs. I've seen them as tall as this. I guess that's a carpinus there, as tall as that tree and as wide. So, but if you have a small garden, there are a lot of small selections. There's some selections that are smaller than this. Now, like all hydrangeas, let me throw the last weed down. I'm probably not going to find any fertile flowers, but on all hydrangeas, especially wild type hydrangeas, you have fertile flowers and sterile flowers. The big showy ones are the sterile flowers. They sort of act like petals on something like a tulip. And then the tiny little flowers inside are the fertile flowers. If you grow hydrangea paniculata, one of the ones with a looser head and more fertile flowers, it's quite a good plant for pollinators. There's that word again. These are showy. The other ones are equally showy, but there's light and lacy looking. And one of the most common questions you get when you work in a public garden, or probably if you work as a master garden, is why aren't my hydrangeas blooming? Well, usually it's the blue hydrangea macrophylla. Well, they bloom on old wood, which doesn't mean, old like, centuries old. It just means stems that were produced the previous year. And those flower buds are there by late summer in the terminal bud on the stem on hydrangea macrophylla. So if you cut those stems back, you're cutting off the flower buds. And if it's one of the standard types that just blooms once a year, you're not going to have any flowers. Hydrangea paniculata blooms on new wood, which means it blooms on the wood it produces in the current year. So if you cut this to the ground in winter or early spring, it's still going to bloom that same year. So I know when somebody says, why aren't my hydrangeas blooming, they're usually talking about macrophylla and not paniculata. Yeah, well, again, it's not really, it's more sort of midsummer. The Lycoris, they have a bunch of common names, naked ladies, because they bloom without their foliage. The foliage is produced either later on in the year or in the spring, depending on the species. You know, spider lilies, but many things are called spider lilies. But this is Lycoris haywardii, which is notable for its purple flowers with the blue tips. They're easy, permanent bulbs that multiply underground. They're not in bloom terribly long, but they sure are a delightful surprise when they bloom. We saw the flame acanthus on the roof. This is the one I mentioned, pumpkin, which is a more orange colored. Not heavily in bloom now, but I see all these new shoots coming on. They'll be in bloom before too long. Maybe a week of below normal temperatures and clouds and some heavy rains have sort of discouraged it from blooming, but now that we're back to full force summer, I'm sure it'll be back in bloom. I'm sort of inclined to call it a morning. Is that all right with everybody? Any questions before we go? Well, thank you for everybody for coming out, putting up with the heat.
Thank you, Doug.
All right, thank you.